Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Beat the Big Guys. I'm your host, Sandy Rosenthal, and today I have a guest from the great part of the country, New England, and more specifically, New Hampshire, Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Her name is Andrea Amico. Hey, Andrea.
Hi, Sandy.
I did pronounce your name wrong. It's Andrea Amico.
Yes,
And,
correct.
and may I call you Andrea?
Yes, you may.
Okay. Thanks so much. So I am going to go ahead and read a short bio that you supplied for me. Thank you so much. And then we'll get right to it.
Sounds
Okay.
great.
Okay, dope. Andrea Amico is co-founder of Testing for Peas. Is it peas or peace?
Peas.
Peas, okay? A community action group that formed in 2015 as a result of PFAS contamination at the former Pease Air Force Base in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Andrea's family has been impacted by highly contaminated drinking water. She is passionate about raising awareness of PFAS water contamination, providing education to impacted communities, lowering standards for PFAS in drinking water, and collaborating with others from all aspects of PFAS to achieve a common goal of reducing PFAS exposure to impacted communities. Her advocacy has been instrumental in securing a PFAS blood testing program and 2 PFAS health studies for her Peas community. That's amazing. Today, PFAS is found in nearly half, 45%, of U.S. faucets, according to researchers. That is absolutely incredible. So thank you so much for being here and for joining me today. And before we talk about PFAS, and which is an incredibly important topic that everyone should know about, I just wanted to talk just for a moment about your home state of New Hampshire. So, when you talk to people from outside of New England and ask them, okay, which state is on the right, which state is on the left, does anybody know which one's on the right or the left?
Not usually, no.
Not usually. I you see, I'm from New England. I'm born in Massachusetts, and so often when I talk about New England to people outside of the area, they just know it's a bunch of states all crammed up there in the corner,
Yeah,
and they don't really know what order they're in. So,
right.
but I happen to know that Vermont is on the left, on the west, and New Hampshire is on the right or on the east.
That's correct. Yeah.
Good.
And I happen to live in a really beautiful part of New Hampshire. It's called the Seacoast region.
Mhm.
We're about 11 miles of shoreline right on the Atlantic Ocean. And we're sandwiched right between Massachusetts and Maine. So I live right on the seacoast part, which I think is one of the most beautiful places in the country.
It is, and I bet you get to eat lots of lobster.
Yep. Yep. There's lots of oysters here and shellfish and lobsters. And yeah, New England's beautiful for sure. We have the mountains, we have the ocean, we have, major cities. Like it's a wonderful place to live and raise a family. I love it here.
I couldn't agree more. I still call it home, even though I've lived in New Orleans for 2/3 of my life. I still call New England home.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I
Yeah.
miss it. Well, thank you for joining me from the other side of the country. So, Andrea, talk to us about PFAS, and why should we care about it?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, PFAS is a class of man-made chemicals. There's thousands of them. I've lost track of how many. But the biggest concerning part of this class of chemicals known as PFAS is that they bioaccumulate or they build up in the body, they build up in the environment, and they stay in your body for a long time. And they're toxic at incredibly low levels. They've been associated with multiple adverse health effects that impact multiple systems of the body. And we are learning more and more about PFAS. We're detecting them more in our drinking water. We're learning that they're in many of our everyday products. And we're learning more about the health impacts of these chemicals. And research has shown that 99% of Americans have some levels of PFAS in their blood. So this is really an issue that affects all of us. Although sometimes we hear about some communities that are highly impacted, whether they live near military bases or fire airports. or chemical manufacturing sites. The reality is we're all impacted by PFAS, some more than others, but they are a class of concerning chemicals that we need to be paying more attention to, and we need to do more to regulate and stop exposure.
So talk to us about, thank you for explaining why we should care about it. And boy, you got our attention now. Tell us about what you did about it.
So in 2000, so I live, as I mentioned, I live in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, beautiful coastal town, picturesque place to raise a family. It is also home to a former Air Force base known as the Pease Air Force Base, which did close down in 1991, and it was very successfully redeveloped into what we call now the Pease Trade Port. So if you were to drive to the Pease Trade Port today, located in my town of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, you wouldn't know that it was a former military base. It's businesses, there's a golf course, there's community colleges. It's not a place people live, but it's a place people come to work, to recreate. There's restaurants, medical office buildings, etc. And so in 2007, my husband and I moved up to Portsmouth, New Hampshire from Massachusetts. And we got married in 2008, and we had our first child in 2011. My husband worked for a business at the Pease Trade Port, and we sent our two children. We eventually had 3 children, but our 2 older children went to daycare at the Pease Trade Port. And it was a beautiful daycare center. It was right next door to his work. It was, everything we had hoped for our children. But in May of 2014, I read a newspaper article that made my heart sink. I had learned that high levels of PFAS were detected in the drinking water wells at the Pease Trade Port, where my husband was working every day and where my 2 young children were attending daycare full time and drinking the water every day. I am an occupational therapist. I am not a scientist, an engineer. So reading this article and hearing about the high levels of PFAS, I had no idea what PFAS were. I didn't know what they meant. I had never heard of them before. But the contamination in one of the wells at the trade port was so elevated that they had to shut the well down. And I knew that having to shut down a major drinking water well was clearly significant, and that the contamination was obviously very concerning. And so I was angry, I was frustrated, I was anxious. I felt so much guilt as a mother that my kids were exposed to contaminated water unbeknownst to me. And instead of kind of, drowning in those feelings and feeling overwhelmed and not taking action, I used that energy to fuel my action. And so I collaborated with a couple other mothers whose children also went to the daycare center. And we formed a group called Testing for Peas, and we really educated ourselves about what PFAS were. And one of the first things we learned was that these chemicals build up in the body, and that you can have a blood test to learn how much of the chemicals are in your body.
You can or cannot?
You can.
Can.
Yep.
Okay.
You can. So when we formed Testing for Peas, the first goal that we had was to advocate for a PFAS blood testing program for the Pease community. Anyone who was at the trade port drinking the water, who worked there, the children who went to daycare there, the former service members who were stationed there years ago. That took a lot of advocacy. At the time, no one really knew what PFAS were. PFAS blood tests were and still are very expensive. They're not easy to access. Only a few labs in the country can do them. It's not something you can coordinate through your doctor. I mean, it's gotten better, but back then you could not get a PFAS blood test through your doctor. It was very complicated, expensive. So we really had to push our state health department to do it. And we were met with some resistance because of cost, because of, they kept saying, well, it won't tell you anything. It will tell you if your levels are elevated, but then we can't tell you if that will result in health effects. And even at the time, they were minimizing health effects associated with PFAS. They were saying, well, we don't even know that PFAS cause harm. So it took a lot of advocacy on our part, a lot of making phone calls, talking to our local, state, federal officials, but we eventually did get a PFAS blood testing program for the community. And they had about almost 2,000 people participate in that, adults and children. And it did show that our community had significantly elevated PFAS levels in our blood when compared to the general population. And so once we got those results, that really fueled our advocacy to advocating for health studies. Now we know our levels are elevated. you can't really tell us what that means, but then you should study us. You should learn more. And so we were successful in getting 2 PFAS health studies for the PEAS community. And alongside of our advocacy for that, we strongly pushed that the Air Force, who was no longer active at the PEAS trade port, but was responsible for the contamination, we pushed really hard that they would come in and clean up the contamination, remediate it. And they are actually the ones paying for one of our health studies as well. The Air Force is paying for it. So really pushing for that accountability, and not only taking the accountability, but taking the actions needed to help the community better understand this exposure, stop the exposure. And ultimately, we just want to be made whole again. You know, we as community members, and this goes for anyone, whether you live outside a military base like my family did, or you're outside a chemical manufacturing plant, or you're near a landfill that has maybe contaminated your private well. We didn't sign up for this. We didn't ask for this, you know, and it shouldn't fall on the people. The victims of this contamination should not be the ones to bear the burden of paying for blood tests, paying for remediation, paying for cleanup. That absolutely needs to fall on the people who caused this problem in the first place.
Bravo. There's so many things you mentioned in the just a couple of few short minutes that you spoke that I almost don't know where to begin. But thank you so much for taking that anger and channeling it into something positive. It would be so easy to just proverbially suck your thumb in this situation. Nobody would blame you. Nobody would blame you. It would be easier, expensive, admittedly, but easier to just pack up and leave. But you didn't. And so thank you from the bottom of my heart for your unparalleled moral authority, and for taking that and to use it to make the world a better place. One place at a time. So thank you so much. So let's start here. So many things you said are worth talking about for a little bit more. So you mentioned that not only is PFAS in drinking water, you also mentioned that it's in some products as well. So which products are these?
Yeah, so I mean, unfortunately, PFAS are in so many things we don't even know. So I guess just to explain for folks, PFAS have amazing properties that as consumers really like. They're heat resistant, water resistant. They put out fuel-based fires. You know, there's a lot of great properties. They are stain resistant. So you can commonly find
Teflon.
So like you can see them in nonstick pans.
Case in point.
You can see
I remember when my dad brought home his first Teflon pan. I remember it was like yesterday. It was probably 45 years ago, but it's a really cool product. It also caused cancer.
Exactly. Yeah. And you'll see PFAS though, they use them to stain proof carpets and couches. They're in cosmetics, dental floss. They're in fast food packaging because they're grease resistant, microwave popcorn bags. They're in your rain gear, you know, your waterproof clothing because they repel water. So they have a lot of properties that we as consumers appreciate and enjoy. However, the products and the things that we purchase with PFAS are not adequately labeled. They don't tell us PFAS are in them, you know, and unfortunately, we're all exposed to PFAS, not only through drinking water, but in many other pathways. And we need to do better about really thinking about, even though these chemicals have great properties that are useful to us as consumers, we have to think about the bigger picture. I mean, they're called forever chemicals. They don't break down. They build up in our bodies. They build up in the environment. They're passed from moms to babies through the placenta, through breast milk. So babies are being born pre-polluted with PFAS. I mean, so when you think of the trade-offs of, wow, I could have a stain resistant carpet, but these are chemicals that are going to be carried on for generations, I think I'd take the stains on my carpet, you know, like you have to start thinking about what are the essential uses for chemicals that carry such significant impacts to our bodies and the environment.
Absolutely. So thank you for clarifying on that. So it's not so if you're one of those communities that doesn't have PFAS in your drinking water, you shouldn't just forget this topic because it's probably in the products that you're using. It affects all of us. And I think you raised a good point. Media has a tendency to say things I think in the article I read that came out just today, they talked about how the poorer communities, at-risk communities, are more likely to have PFAS in their water. And while that may be true, in my mind, we can't just dismiss it
Oh, for sure. I
wholesale.
think we see
It's
there's
everywhere.
absolutely environmental justice concerns around PFAS. I mean,
Mhm.
I see that as someone who helped found a national coalition for PFAS contamination with multiple community leaders. We absolutely see environmental justice communities disproportionately harmed by PFAS for sure.
And
And
but
one way
it's
we
not
see that,
only these communities, and while as important as it is, and it is, it's not only these communities, and people are very quick to say, well, that's not my problem. No, it's
correct.
all of
Yeah,
our
it's
problem.
frankly, this PFAS affects all of us. It really does. I mean, again, 99% of Americans have PFAS in their blood. And even if you're not drinking contaminated water, you're being exposed in other ways through your products, through your food. The other thing, we didn't touch upon, if you live in a community with high contamination, oftentimes the wildlife, the fish, the deer, the plants, the vegetables in the area are also contaminated. So
Absolutely.
even you get contaminated through multiple exposure pathways. And that's something to keep in mind.
We all need to be concerned about this. Andrea, you mentioned something that I want to remind our listeners, because it's very important. So Andrea mentioned that she's not a scientist. So when she found out about the elevated levels of PFAS, she mentioned she's not a scientist. She's not a chemist. You said you have in occupational therapy.
Occupational therapy. Yeah,
Okay.
I work in rehabilitation.
Okay, that's a great career. Uh, but she mentioned she's not a chemist, she's not a scientist, but she understood enough to know that that was very, very important. And it's
Mhm.
really interesting if you look at all of the great advocacy, the greatest people who did the greatest advocacy through the centuries. It's usually not an expert in that field for a variety of reasons. If you are an expert in your field, you may be taking a risk in being shunned by
Mhm.
your community if you raise a red flag about something that's making a lot of money for some people.
Mhm.
And clearly, companies like DuPont, 3M are making a lot of money.
Mhm.
And we haven't discussed it today, but they knew for years that these chemicals
Right.
don't go away, that they get into our bodies and stay there. They knew
Mhm.
that for years. So, and that's for anyone who'd like to know more about this, the information is out there. And at the end of the show, maybe you can recommend your favorite reading material
Sure.
the listeners who would like to know more about that. But getting back to beating the big guys and advocating and doing the right thing, don't be concerned that you're not an expert in that particular thing. In fact, it's better if you're not. It's better
Yeah.
if you're not.
Yeah.
And
And I
you can
think,
hire a
I mean,
chemist.
yeah. And back in 2014, when this first became an issue in my community, we were one of the first communities to grapple with this, which is hard to believe in just less than 10 years. So many communities, it's come into the spotlight for them. But back in 2014, I had a real hard time finding information on PFAS. It just wasn't mainstream. It wasn't studied like it is now. I found documents from the EPA that were like hundreds of pages long. I found a few newspaper articles and the C8 health study, which took place in Parkersburg, West Virginia. But yeah, I mean, I'm not a scientist. I wasn't an expert, but I really dove in and read everything that I could. I reached out to people. We had a scientist who lived in our community who was familiar with PFAS, and I quickly connected with her, and she was able to provide me with studies. And so, yeah, it doesn't take a college degree or an expert to consume the information. And I think when it directly affects your family, it takes on a different meaning, it takes on a different role for you. And when it comes to PFAS, it is a complicated issue. It is complex, but the information's out there. There's plenty of people out there who can guide you. And at the end of the day, for me, the science helped me, but I was following my heart, and I was following, like, knowing that my family had been highly exposed to chemicals. I didn't need a science degree to tell me, like, I want their blood tested. I want to know the health effects that they're going to face down the line. I want my water cleaned up. I want my community made whole. So I think I don't want anyone to ever be scared away from advocacy because they're not an expert. If anything, I think advocates have such a powerful voice because we come to the table truly just wanting our families to be made whole again and truly wanting our communities to receive the justice that they deserve. And that's a really, really powerful voice.
Very powerful words that you just said. I hope everyone was listening very, very carefully. It is absolutely 1000% true. So have you familiar, Andrea, of the book Toxic Sludge is Good for You?
I have not heard of that.
It's a book that was written about 30 years ago and which is still every bit as true today. And what companies putting poisons in our bodies will often in the beginning, especially in the earliest years, months and years, try to tell us that it's good for us, that it's actually good for our bodies to have a little PFAS. And I'm wondering if you ever heard anything like that in your work fighting against PFAS pollution, or that a little bit didn't matter.
Yeah, I mean,
a little bit didn't hurt.
I think what we hear, so oftentimes when we talk about PFAS, we talk about it in the part per trillion range,
right?
Which for some people, that is just such a small amount. When we think of other contaminants, we think part per billion, part per million.
Wow.
So when you start getting down to part per trillion, I mean, you're talking super, super small amounts. And
super poisonous.
Yeah. So early on in my advocacy, people would say, well, it's just parts per trillion. I mean, that's like one drop in an Olympic sized swimming pool, right?
It's just a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, so I have heard people try to minimize the amount because it's part per trillion. And my counter to that point is, yes, but I mean, we're talking, the EPA came out for 2 different PFAS. For health advisories, they're talking in the parts per quadrillion in terms of what would be a safe level for people. So we're going even one magnitude lower. And I think what I like to share with people who try to minimize the part per trillion or how these such small amounts don't matter. I mean, what's scary to me is that such a small amount is so toxic to the human.
That's what in my mind, I said the fact they were even taking the pains to detect it at such small levels, it must be really toxic.
Correct. And I mean, and I think we're finally seeing the EPA back that up. We're finally seeing the EPA move forward with setting health advisories and proposing standards in drinking water that are protective of human health. Unfortunately, it's very long overdue for people who have been exposed for a long time, but we're finally seeing our federal agencies step up and acknowledge that as well and take action to protect people. And so yeah, to your point, I have heard people try to minimize the small amounts and how they're not a problem, but they absolutely are, even at very low doses.
The people making money on PFAS will say anything, and you just have to be ready, and you have to be ready for them. And that's just going to be one of the things you'll hear. And it's common, it's across the board. Another thing I wanted to you touched on today, and I wanted to talk about a little bit more. The people who are responsible should be held accountable. And to use a very blunt word, blame should be put out there. Fingers should be pointed. And one of the things an advocate will hear in trying to get the truth out is, well, you're just interested in blaming people. That's all you care about. And it's one of those, things to try to rattle you. No, you're not interested in blaming. You probably, Andrea, you probably never heard of PFAS or even heard about any of these things until it began affecting your family. So to say that all you care about is placing blame is absurd. It's absurd, and you'll hear it. I'm sure you just want somebody to pay, or you'll hear things like that. Am I right?
I think ultimately what folks want is accountability. As a mother, I did not agree to my children drinking highly contaminated water. I didn't agree to purchase cosmetics that have PFAS in it that's not labeled properly or have it in my food. And so at the end of the day, folks need to understand communities we didn't sign up for this. We didn't
Right.
volunteer for this. And unfortunately, we have become guinea pigs in experiments we didn't sign up for. And there are companies out there who knew about the harms of these chemicals for a very long time.
Right.
They hid that from our regulatory bodies. They hid that from the general public. And they continue to manufacture these chemicals and make a lot of money off of them, unfortunately, to the detriment of not only our whole country, but frankly, the entire world. I mean, PFAS is a global issue. It's found in polar bears, it's found in the ice caps of Antarctica. It's a global issue. And so the people who absolutely profited off of making these chemicals, knowing the harms that they caused, should 100% be held accountable. And and the National Coalition of Community Advocates that I'm a part of, we say that we want the polluters to pay. It shouldn't be on the burden of the people who have been harmed to have to pay for blood testing, pay for health studies, pay for clean water, pay for remediation. It should absolutely be the people who profited off of these chemicals should be paying the price, and making these communities whole again. This is no fault of our own. We are exposed and contaminated at no fault of our own. And we should not, we're already paying the price where our families are sick. Some people's property values, they've lost their property values because they live in contaminated areas. Our cities and municipalities have had to pay for expensive filtration to make sure we're providing clean water. Our state health departments have funded blood testing and health studies. That's all coming out of the pockets of the people who have been harmed the most. And that's 100% wrong.
Very well said. So this was an excellent segue. We started talking about blame and your detractors, and if you're out there trying to make the world a better place, you will get detractors, people who think you're on the wrong track. And if they come at you and try to say, well, you're just interested in placing blame, you're just interested in pointing fingers, the way to respond to that is usually, I was so surprised when I first heard it. I was confused and surprised by it. But when it comes, get ready. Just calmly say, "I'm interested in the truth," and stay calm. I'm interested in the truth, and then and what you're going to do with that truth. I'm interested in the truth. I'm not interested in blame. And
the
then
other thing, Sandy, if I can just add to that too, is it's not only about placing blame. I think one thing that's been really important for me is that we learn from this mistake as a society, as a governmental agency, as governmental agencies, as chemical manufacturers. Like, this is a catastrophic issue that will affect generations of people. It will cost billions, if not trillions, to fully address. And how do we prevent this from ever happening again? It's not only, it's like exposing the truth and holding polluters accountable, but it's also learning lessons so we don't repeat this mistake again with another class of chemicals down the line, because this was a really, really big mistake that has affected, frankly, our whole planet. So how do we learn from this mistake and not let it put the safety measures in place so it can't happen again? That's really important to me too.
Absolutely. Well said. And then the next thing you had just started to touch on, and it's something that I wanted to talk about as well, is you pointed out how the victims are the people that end up with the burden, the burden of proving that they're sick, and proving that there's PFAS in their body, and proving, and then this costs money. And it's so wrong that the burden is on the victims. I'm not saying it should be, that it is. Right. It falls upon the victims, and it's wrong. It makes my blood boil. And thank you for that's enough to make some people just want to give up and say, the burden shouldn't be on me. But unfortunately, in this country right now, it often is. Not always, but often the burden of proof of what's going on is on the victims that are being affected by it. These tricks that the chemical companies played, they would change the chemical compound of a PFAS by 1 neutron, and then send it back out there. And so now EPA had to completely do all their testing, and just because they've changed it by one, they just changed the definition by a neutron, and they got away with this for years. And we got to, and you're right, we got to make sure that chemical companies can't do that to us again.
Correct.
The playbook. They're all working out of the same playbook. Well, thank you so much. Is there anything that you would like to share with our listeners before we sign off today?
I think that just my concluding message would be that, PFAS is a problem that affects all of us. You hear about it in the news more and more, which is great. There's a lot more awareness out there, but it's affecting all of us. So help support laws that will allow better PFAS regulations. A lot of states are doing great things to ban PFAS, to regulate it in drinking water. The EPA is catching up with some of their work. So help support those efforts. Be as an informed consumer as you can. Unfortunately, a lot of products aren't labeled with PFAS in them, but think about products that are non-stick and fast food packaging and all of that. And, do your best to avoid those so you can minimize your exposure. There's great resources out there. There's so many amazing websites. I don't know if you want me to touch upon those now, but
Sure, now would be a fine time.
yeah. So like, I love the Environmental Working Group. They have a lot of great resources on PFAS. Another is Silent Spring Institute, has a lot on how to get your blood tested for PFAS, physician guidance, how to talk to your physician if you've been exposed. You can look up the National PFAS Contamination Coalition. That's a group of community leaders that I'm a part of, and we work together at a national level to bring about change. But just being an informed consumer, supporting legislative efforts to help ban PFAS or stop exposure. If you are concerned about PFAS in your drinking water, you can have it tested. If you live on a private well, you can speak to your municipality about their testing. Just become more informed about it, because it is an issue that's affecting all of us. And there's a lot of great resources and information out there.
Thanks so much for your advocacy, and thank you for sharing that with us. If you all out there haven't been thinking about PFAS, I'm sure you are now. So thanks again. Thank you, Andrea, and thanks to you, the listeners, for being here with us today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please be sure to like, subscribe, and rate this podcast on all of your favorite platforms. And remember, no matter who you are, you too can beat the big guys. Okay, Andrea, stay with me.
Okay.